Sports Report. I am your host, Avishai Saul, and I've been inspired. I've been inspired by all of the wonderful sports out and about in these past few days and weeks. Inspired me to sing the sports song. Oh no, my team lost again. No, my team shit the bed. We were up by a lot of sport points, but then, to my chagrin, the other team came all the way back to win the game again. Oh, my team lost again. We're going to start this week the way we've started the last couple of weeks, which is the report on March Madness. It is the dominant story in sports right now, and it's been so weird, to be honest. March Madness is always a great sporting event. The instant one-game elimination, all the different schools, the history with each, the NBA prospects, the seniors playing for, their future basketball careers, the coaches, the characters, the student body, the betting. It's just this wonderful, perfect storm of sports entertainment. But this year has been especially weird because of the amount of upsets that have happened. There have been a number of strong teams, some strong favorites with exceptional players on each of them that have lost in the early rounds. We've already seen some of the powerhouses touted to maybe win the entire thing go down. Some notable teams like Kansas, Purdue, Duke, Baylor, Texas, all losing. Now, some of those teams were matched up against other very promising teams. Kansas, of course, going down against the NBA chock-full Arkansas. But some of those teams just lost to underdogs. Purdue was featuring our favorite player in the tournament, Zach Edey, the 7'4", 300-pound Canadian behemoth, touted to go in the NBA's second round. But they lost. They lost to, I don't know, some bunch of I don't even know the school. Listen, there are still great teams in the tournament. Teams like Arkansas, teams like UConn and Alabama. But, it's just weird to be losing so many great. We thought we were going to get these matchups, and already we're starting to lose a lot of the premier talent that was going into this tournament. Now, for our main segment, I've spoken how this season is going to be a little bit more me doing what I want to do and me saying what I want to say. And here's an example here, because I saw recently there was a YouTube channel and an Instagram channel I followed that had been posting content about the greatest NBA teams in the history of the league. Here's the thing. I have a lot of love for sports fans. I think sports fandom is a beautiful thing. I'm a sports fan myself, and I spend a lot of time with sports fans. But when it comes to the history of the league, whether it be the NBA, NFL, NHL, MLB, what have you, the average sports fan knows really little. And it appears when they post these polls like that. So I'm going to correct those fans who might think that Team X is better than Team Y by going through the 10 greatest NBA teams in the history of the league and explaining why for each. Some ground rules for my list. You must be an NBA champion, not promoting no losers to the top 10 greatest teams of all time. Furthermore, this team will be a certain vintage. I believe that when discussing lists like this, you need to pick a specific year, because the 1981 Celtics are very different than the 1986 Celtics, and you can't just say 80s Celtics, because then it's two different Celtics. And we're going to start off the list with the 1983 Philadelphia 76ers. This team is often attributed to the great play of one Julius Erving, Dr. J, one of the most famous basketball players of all time, a iconic dunker, superstar, flashy, stats, culture, everything you want from a professional athlete. But what they don't remember about this, his championship season in the NBA, is that he was really past his prime at this point. Dr. J had had an incredible stretch through the 70s and early 80s, but by 1983 he had really lost a bit of his step on the athletic end, and you know, it was harder to stay young as an athlete when you played in the 70s and 80s. So by 83, Dr. J was not the Dr. J we think of when we think Dr. J. But that doesn't mean he wasn't amazing. And that 1983 team featured such players as Andrew Toney, Maurice Cheeks, and most famously, their superstar, the guy who ended up winning Finals MVP, Moses Malone. Now, Moses Malone is one of the most underrated players in the history of the NBA. He was an incredible center, incredible rebounder, incredible scorer, interior player, post player. And on these 83 Sixers, it's Malone, not Dr. J, that brought the team to the title. Next, we're going to move on to number 9, where we have the Bad Boy Pistons, specifically the 1989 Bad Boys, when they were a little younger, a little fresher, and really kicking everybody's ass. The Bad Boy Pistons got that title by being bad boys. They had a reputation as one of the dirtiest teams in the history of professional sports, led of course by their little badass general Isaiah Thomas, who was the sort of spiritual leader of the team, would tell the bigger guys, you know, knock him on his ass, go punch him in. He once punched Karl Malone in the face. Now for reference, Isaiah Thomas 6'1", maybe 185, Karl Malone 6'9", 250. And Isaiah, you know, went right at him. Some other great notable players on that team is Rick Mahorn, Bill Laimbeer, Dennis Rodman, Joe Dumars. Just a great collective of gritty, defensive-minded NBA players who had no problem throwing elbows and punches if need be to win that championship. And of course they did, back-to-back in 89 and 90. Now moving on to the 07 San Antonio Spurs. This was Tim Duncan at his peak, but also surrounded by Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili at their peak. It was sort of the collective peak. Maybe you could argue that Duncan was better in 03. Maybe you could argue that Parker was better in 09. But as a team, 07 was the best. And this was the team that cemented Spurs culture. The one that proved that they were on the cutting edge of basketball science with the drive and kick mentality, pass-first playmaking, switching defensive schemes, and of course Tim Duncan, their Hall of Famer and MVP, in the middle, leading the way on both offense and defense. Now moving on to number 7, we have the 2013 Miami Heat. You may remember the Big three of the Miami Heat: LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh. The Heatles, this was LeBron at his athletic peak. This was LeBron when he first really broke out and cemented himself as the NBA's undisputed top dog. This was the year where LeBron vanquished all challengers. In 2013, LeBron won his 4th MVP. He rattled off an impressive statistical season, and the team had an incredible amount of success, winning over 60 games and of course going on that great win streak that they did. Now he was also flanked by Dwayne Wade, who at this point was still maybe not quite in his prime, but at the tail end of what would be considered his prime. And of course we can't forget about Chris Bosh, former Raptor, one of the more unselfish players in the history of the league, as he sacrificed his time as an all-star on a losing team to be the 3rd banana on one of the greatest teams of all time. Now moving on to number 6, where we have the 1963 Boston Celtics. Yes, we're going all the way back to 1963 for this one because it is important to mention the success of the great Bill Russell. Now, the 60 Celtics won so many championships, it's tough to pick a specific season to cement as their absolute peak. But I chose 63 for a couple of reasons. One, it was Bill Russell at his absolute athletic peak. But 63 is also notable because of his teammates. This was one of the years where one Johnny Havlicek, the superstar 6th man who would go on to lead the Celtics to a championship by himself later in the 70s. Havlicek, a young player in 63, overlapped with the old guard of the Celtics who were drafted in the 50s. Of course, Bill Russell, the biggest name of the bunch, but also Tommy Heinsohn and the Houdini of the hardwood himself, the Coos, Bob Cousy, who, before Bill Russell came along, was considered the greatest basketball player of all time. And Cousy, overlapping with Heinsohn and Russell and Havlicek and Sam Jones, of course, shooter. It was that mix of talent and that dominance that made me pick them as the top team. Now moving into our top 5, where we have the 1987 Los Angeles Lakers. This is Magic Johnson at his absolute peak. It's tough to know whether or not to go with 1987 or 85 or even before, because as Magic got better as the decade went on, his running mate Kareem aged and got worse. But for the case of the Lakers, I think it's important to pick their top player at his best, which is, of course, Magic Johnson. Kareem, incredible player, of course, but for the Lakers, it was Magic first. This is James Worthy at his best. This is Kareem still at his very, very good. And, of course, Michael Cooper, who gets left out of these lists when mentioned a lot of the time. Michael Cooper was an incredible player, and it's important to remember him. Now moving on to number 4, where we have the 2001 Los Angeles Lakers. This is notable because it is Shaq and Kobe at their best. 2001, Shaq was the unstoppable force. He was an incredible physical beast that nobody could do anything with. It was really impossible. This was Shaq at his best, Shaq at his most dominant, and the best team he had really to that point, with Kobe, who had evolved into a superstar in his own right, and a star-studded group supporting cast with Rick Fox, Horace Grant, Robert Horry, Derek Fisher. Now in our top 3, and number 3 on my list might be a little controversial, but I have here the 1996 Chicago Bulls. A lot of you are thinking like, what? The Chicago Bulls number 3. Why wouldn't they be number 1? It's Michael Jordan. It's the 96 Bulls, the most winning record from a championship winning team in the history of basketball. Why wouldn't they be number 1? Well, I'll tell you. First of all, you don't know what my other 2 is, so shut the fuck up. There's some lore about the 1996 Bulls that is overblown. One being Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman in 1996 was an incredibly valuable player, but to suggest that the 80s version of Dennis Rodman wasn't a more impactful defensive player, more impactful physical athlete, in comparison to his 1996 version, the partying, the drinking, the WWE-ing, the Carmen Electra-ing version of Dennis Rodman is just a media fabrication, because Rodman was better when he was with the Bad Boy Pistons. Also, their winning record. Now, this is important to keep in mind. The 1996 Bulls won over 70 games, which is incredible, but keep in mind, the league had expanded that year. 2 new teams, the Vancouver Grizzlies and Toronto Raptors, which means that the talent in the NBA was diluted. More teams means more players, which means lower quality. So, is the 71 win season incredible? Yes, but it might not be as incredible as our number 1 team. But up before the number 2 team, which is the 1986 Boston Celtics. It was the 86 Celtics dominating, and they wiped the floor with the league. This was Larry Bird at his peak. This was Kevin McHale at his peak. This was Robert Parrish, Dennis Johnson, Danny Ainge, Bill Walton. This was one of the most beautifully constructed basketball teams ever. The passing, the scoring, the shooting, the mindset, the coach, everything. This was Boston Celtics basketball at its best. Even better than the title teams of the 60s because of how talented the league was in the mid to late 80s, and because of the play of one Larry Bird, who in 86 was at his absolute peak before his back gave out and he had to retire early. But even the 86 Celtics don't hold the candle to the team I'm about to mention at number 1, and is the 2017 Golden State Warriors. This is Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. This is Kevin Durant at his peak. This is Draymond Green at his peak. This is Andre Iguodala, arguably at his peak for sort of the latter half of his career once he embraced the Warriors role. They were an unstoppable force. There was nothing anyone could do. And I know they had won more games the previous season, but it really doesn't matter. Pick another team on this list. How could the 86 Celtics hang with the Warriors physically? Their speed. Who would guard Durant? McHale? Out on the perimeter the whole game, have him guard somebody from 30 feet? You may argue the 2001 Lakers could dominate them inside with Shaq. And while you make a valid point, it's not like the 2017 Warriors didn't have big bodies to throw at Shaq. Like, yeah, their bigs weren't, like, good, but they were big. No team has ever had more offensive weapons. This has been the OCAD Sports Report. I am your host, Avishai Saul, and I will see you all next week.